Bon après-midi. Welcome, Excellencies, as well as distinguished guests. We are delighted to have you here. As you know, our topic, setting the table, fact, fiction, and foundations to alleviate hunger. It's complicated. With Dr. Don Buckingham and with Julia Sáez. Some of you had opportunity to hear them last evening. And they're talking about for the love of food, pondering Christmas, abundance, and scarcity. It was a delightful insight, both into who they are. I mean, we've known each other for a short time, or not a short time, for some time, but just I got insights that were far beyond what I had known before. It was wonderful, not only about who they are, but also their area of expertise. But today is the serious day. Today is the day that they're going to dig deep and give better understanding of what is. We are a non-government organization that has been operating here in Ottawa for over 40 years, and we celebrated 40 years in September. We seek to make a difference for each of you in your areas of work professionally, personally, and spiritually. We work with leaders of all backgrounds, faith backgrounds, diplomatic leaders, parliamentary leaders, as well as business leaders. And so last evening at our function, we had about 200 leaders and tried to have a good mix around each table. I think there were some good conversations while we enjoyed our delicious meal. So that's a little bit about who we are. Again, we're motivated by God's love and desire to make Him known for those who have that kind of interest. But yes, at this point in time, I will introduce our speakers and our moderators, so then we get to hear the presentation, which we were really here for. So I do want to introduce Julia. First of all, Julia Sáez. She's Senior Policy Advisor on Agriculture and Food Systems at Canadian Foodgrains Bank. And so some of you will know that, others not, but it's a partnership of 15 Canadian churches and church-based agencies that work together to end global hunger. And so Julia is a big part of what they do in that regard. And she does have a master's in sustainable food systems from the American University of Rome. She may tell you why it is she went there. But she's done a number of other things, but again, she'll tell you that. But she does speak French, Spanish, and Italian, at least, perhaps other languages too. So she'll be happy to converse with you in any of those languages, I believe. She started a baking business at age 12, correct? Because of her passion for food, 12. So again, whether she tells some of that today or after, you can enjoy those stories. We did enjoy some last evening. So I will continue with the introduction so we can hear the presentation. Don Buckingham, inductee in the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame. And that's because of the work that he's done in synthesizing, applying, and teaching Canadian agricultural law. And he's done that in many different contexts, as I understand. So he too is a lifelong learner. He's had a little longer life to do it in. A professor, a gardener, chef, expert on food and agricultural law, and grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if you've been there yet, but if not, he'll convince you to go. And apparently still owns 2 cows, but I'm not sure where those cows are.
They live in Saskatchewan.
They do, okay. So someone else is obviously caring well for them. But yes, he does have graduate degrees in international development studies and international agricultural trade, as well as food labeling law. At this point in time, would you welcome with me Dr. Don Buckingham and Julia Sáez, who will present for us. They have about 30 minutes, and then you can ask them whatever you like. Denis St-Amour.
Well, it is real joy and delight. I don't know, but I'm thinking that we've gotten soft. This is not a winter sport. This is the start of winter. And when I was growing up in Saskatchewan, we had a rule that it was a snow day and you didn't have to go to school if it was colder than minus 40. Otherwise, get those mitts on and get out there. So maybe I'm just getting old and crotchety, but welcome to winter. Let's not call it winter. We're absolutely delighted that we get 2 opportunities to speak. Last night we had a wonderful group of individuals where we felt the message was for hope and inspiration. We still believe very firmly that our worldview is one of hope and inspiration. But we may have glossed over a couple of very important facts about how difficult the situation of food security is. And so what we like to use today as a metaphor is peeling back the onion. And the onion has several layers, and we're going to focus on two of those layers. One is food production. We're going to do a little less on that, and just acknowledge that there are a few wrinkles. It's not as easy and as carefree as I may have made it out to be last night. And by the same token, food security and food insecurity is very multifaceted. And Julia's going to unpack that because it's her specialty. And as a dad, it's super, super cool to see your child, speed ahead of you on these issues. And so she's the expert. So basically, we're going to say it's complicated. So, it's interesting. I think it's very, very common. And then when I was growing up, there were still newspapers. And you'd sort of say, well, I want objective journalism. But you know what? Objective journalism has never, ever, ever existed. We all come to our positions, our understandings, our identity from a worldview. And either we actively pursue it and we say, I'm an X, or I'm a Y, or I believe this, or I don't, or else we just sort of let it sort of roll over us like a wave. So we come and we recognize that when we make a presentation like this, we have a very clear worldview. And our worldview is Christian. And what that means is that we start from a belief that we have hope in a risen Christ who is here and is present with us and provides hope for a resolved human condition. And so we start with a posture of hope and humility and a sense that we're all in this together, community. Now, I must point out that I fail daily, in fact hourly, in putting all of those values into practice because we're still fallen creatures. But that's our hope, that's our worldview. So on this presentation, I thought it would be fun to talk about agriculture in terms of gardens. There are 4 very, very important gardens in our lives, and we agreed on this one. The first garden was the Garden of Eden. And from our worldview, from the Christian Bible or from the Torah or from the whole idea of many, many traditions, there's this idea that there was a place of harmony. And the place of harmony had animals and it had plants and it had people, and people got along. In fact, in the Bible it says man could eat anything. So there were no poisonous mushrooms, there were no venomous snakes. That would be very cool. You wouldn't have to look out for anything. You could just eat anything. And that kind of all went south or went badly. And the fall happened, human beings disobeyed God, and we got turfed out of the Garden of Eden. That's our cultural, our religious, our spiritual heritage. So we had to work by the sweat of our brow. So the next picture is
my grandma's garden, which would be my dad's mom. And for me, this was always the closest picture that I had of what the Garden of Eden would be like, because this was the biggest garden I had ever seen in my life. It was probably 2 or 3 times the size of this whole space that we can see now. And for much of my life, it was just my grandma. My grandpa passed away when I was 2 years old, and so I thought, why on earth does one person need so much space? But this is because she would grow all of the food that she needed for the whole year. And she had an amazing cold storage where she would keep carrots and potatoes and squash. And I couldn't believe as a kid just the abundance that she had and the generosity that she had in sharing with others. And I knew that if there was ever a national emergency, that's where I should go because I would be well taken care of. And the next garden that I think of is the garden that my parents started at the church that I grew up in. And this garden was created with community at the center. The idea was to bring together people from the local neighborhood to grow food together and to grow food for the local food cupboard. So this is a local food bank, and one of the things that they were most looking for was fresh food. You know, you have a lot of canned food, a lot of dry food, but it's so special when you have something fresh and something that is culturally appropriate for you. So the biggest demand at this particular food cupboard is for kale. And so we had 2 boxes of food that was being dedicated to the food cupboard, and half of one, I think, was just for kale, and just the excitement that the food bank had when we brought it over there, knowing the joy that it would bring to people who were relying on their services.
So professionally and from a family tourism point of view, both have often involved travel around the world. And this last garden is simply a indication of how important gardens are around the world. Our church was involved with a particular project in Haiti, and we went and visited this particular group of individuals who were doing seedlings. And these seedlings were actually going to be the original plants that would go out to many, many gardens. And I got to thinking about how much of common experience this whole gardening process is. So it is, in many respects, it's a cultural moment, but in many respects, as we saw last night, it is the foundation of food security. This personal connection with growing of plants and providing for your community, whether it's a family member, whether it's individuals in community, or whether we have these original pictures of what God had intended. But there's always a but. This particular session, we're going to very quickly go through about 3 initial problems, and then we're going to focus on the last 2, food insecurity and starting simple. So it's complicated. Why is there food insecurity? Why we've just seen all these gardens? Why doesn't everybody just grow their own garden? There's a very famous French author who said, "Cultivez son jardin," cultivate your own garden, and it has an impact that if we just did that, everybody would get along. But Houston, we have a problem. It's never that simple. So let's go looking for where the problem is. Maybe it's in the production. And last night I gave a very rosy picture about how we're going to be able to produce so much. Well, there are consequences to producing so much. And the world is overheating, and agriculture has a bit of a problem in playing the role it does in respect to overheating. So then how about maybe it's consumption? Maybe we're just not doing it right. We have an old expression in our family about chocolate cake, is that you either waste it or waste it. And those happen to be the 2 problems in the world right now. We waste too much food, and in fact, in some places, we eat too much food. And how can that be a problem of food insecurity? Well, it's complicated.
So yes, then we'll delve specifically into food security, and then go into some solutions that we see all the way from personal actions that we can take to looking at the global level.
All right, so food production. There's 2 problems, and they're kind of happening simultaneously: pace and pollution. Pollution is kind of a big word, but pace is, can we keep up with the pace, and can we produce it without destroying the planet? So last night we took a little look at this world population timeline. I'm quite staggered by the numbers when you see them in this particular form. So we have about 2 new Canadas added to the world population every single year, the entire population of Canada. Now, if you're from another country, maybe Nigeria or maybe Indonesia, another Canada, that's small fry. But it's every year this is going up. If we go back to the time of Jesus, we only had about 200 million people. And now we fast forward 2,500 years later, or 2,050 years later, we're going to have 50 times that many. So those people all need to be fed. And where are those people? There's 7 countries listed. Those 7 countries make up more than 50% of the population. So food insecurity has a particular dimension that is how many people live in what space. And Julia's going to be talking about just the whole idea of how that plays itself out in a world scale. But if you only have 40 million people, it might be easier to feed 40 million than it is to feed, let's say, in Indonesia, where you've got 280 million, or in India, where you've got 1.41 billion. So the question then becomes, can we produce enough food? Here again is, it depends. It depends on a bunch of things, so it's complicated. It depends on the population profile. This first graph gives you a sense of how we've been doing in terms of population growth. And from 1,000 to 2,000, there's been this exponential growth. And it is amazing, and I said this last night, it's amazing that we can still produce enough food because we have so many more people. The second graph shows you, based on fertility rates, what the actual population might look like in 2100. And again, this depends a lot on fertility rates. Fertility rates are highest in Asia and in Africa. Right now, they're becoming negative in many places like Europe and in South America. So we don't quite know where that's going to land, but we do know there's going to be more people to feed. Factor number 1. Factor number 2 is we're in a situation right now where we do have enough. We are producing more calories than people need to eat. So that question is, well, maybe we can just kind of sit tight, rest on our laurels, and everybody's going to be happy. We're at about 3,000 calories per person per day worldwide. So why isn't everybody well fed? I'm going to leave that tough question to Julia. So we do, though, I'm going to address the problem of we do need to produce more food. And we do need pretty much to produce about 40 to 70% more. And there's some statistics that say from the year 2000 to the year 2050, it's 50 years, we will produce more food in the world than the entire time humans have been on the planet. Because we're so many and we need so much food. It's staggering that we can do this. So how do we do it? And there's really 2 ways. We can extensify, find more places to grow food, or we can intensify, increasing crop yields. I'm a bit of an agriculture geek and futurist, and some of the stuff that they're coming up with is just out of this world. So we have things, I mentioned them last night, geoponics, aquaponics, hydroponics, aeroponics, and that's just the ponics. So then we have precision agriculture, we've got artificial intelligence, and you sort of, as a person, you say, how does this work? Well, just to give you one example, there are now drones that take pictures of entire fields, and they collect all the data from that particular field, and they will focus on the shape of a weed leaf. Then they will process all this data in a big massive computer, and then they will take that and they will do a field map of exactly where every single individual weed is over 100 hectares. And they will take a drone that is then equipped with pesticide, and the pesticide will spot spray a weed. So that kind of accuracy is what we can do now. And what that does, what's the benefit, is it reduces significantly the amount of pesticides. So rather than a general application over 100 hectares that would take multiple thousands of gallons of herbicide, you can probably do it with 1,000th of the same amount of herbicide. So we can do these kinds of things that will increase production, reduce the kind of waste, and you will get more food. That's just sort of one of the magic bullets that can help. We're with all kinds of genetic modification. I know people are kind of divided on this, so I won't push this very hard. But it is rather appealing to be able to grow a saline-resistant crop in an area that could not grow any agricultural product before. and now you can. So you can grow corn where there's saline soil, or you can grow corn where you couldn't grow corn before because there was not enough moisture. That's all in the pipes. And so we have the opportunity to increase our yields both through hard-on technology fix and also biological, chemical, and physical properties. One of the things that's interesting, weed control. Anybody grow a garden? Weeds are a problem. Pests are a problem. And you've got to deal with them. So they're coming up with all kinds of new ways of doing that. Some people are using steam to kill weeds. Some people are using robots to pick the weeds. And then there's the drones that I talked about. So the problem with that is that's all rosy until you kind of count the costs. And some of the costs are that we are potentially having very devastating environmental impacts because of agriculture. And so this graph over here by Julia, down here on the bottom left, shows our greenhouse gas footprint of different countries in the world. And it's quite dramatic. So we have China that has the highest. We have, there's many that have much, much lower than Canada, but our potential greenhouse gas emissions from just agriculture is about 1.7% of our total emissions. But the graphs on the top are actually, I think, more interesting because of extreme weather. The graph on the far right shows what will happen with projected crop yields in 2050. And if you are a deeper color green, that means your crop yields are going to go up. If you're a deeper color red, that means your crop yields are going to go down. And the reddest is down by 70 to 100%. So that's going to be dramatic. Julia's going to talk about that too. I'm leaving lots on her plate. And also, you can't grow stuff without water. And as we have more significant crop production, we use a lot more water, unless we're doing hydroponics and aquaponics and things like that. And so you can start seeing where the water stream is going to be on the upper left corner. This is across the United States, across Africa, the northern Africa, through the Middle East, through sub-Saharan or southern Asia, and it's quite dramatic, and that's just for 2030. So we may be in a situation where production agriculture is not quite as rosy as I said it was going to be, and that's still to be determined. And again, this is just a few facts and figures about global emissions, agriculture, 5 billion tons. That's pretty hard to get your head around. But compare that to, say, transportation. All the cars and all the trucks in the entire world, they only produce 7 billion tons, and agriculture produces 5 billion. So that's a big chunk. Manufacturing, 6 billion, electricity, 14 billion. Now, one of the ones that's really big is food waste. 3-4 billion tons just comes from wasted food. Now, wasted food happens in two ways. It's either lost in production, can't get it to market, or it's lost to the consumer, can't get it eaten before it molds. Canada's profile, there you see we have 55% from livestock. You hear a lot about livestock being a problem. Yeah, they're kind of the problem, but they're kind of the solution too. So we have to be very careful about how we figure out what happens if suddenly all of the animal protein in the world is gone, both from an economic point of view, from a cultural point of view. I think of Eastern Africa. Animal protein is super, super important culturally. So it's complicated.
So next we look at consumption, and obviously production and consumption are inherently tied, because anything that affects production is going to affect consumption, and that's where we see both the double challenge of having a lot of people in the world who are hungry, but also a lot of people who are eating more calories than are needed. So I wanted to touch on 4 areas in terms of food consumption. So first of all, some of the challenges that increase hunger levels around the world. So we've already touched a little bit on the environmental factors, but we also have a lot of other factors that may affect people's ability to actually access food. So whether that means growing it or just simply being able to purchase it. So we have conflict. Conflict displaces people from the places where they produce food, but it also leads to food shortages as people are moving around and as food sometimes can be weaponized in those contexts. We also have economic disruptions. Obviously, the cost of food can make things really difficult. We also have extreme weather, wealth inequities, discrimination. And where we often see hunger is where these factors compound on one another. So twice a year, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN and World Food Program publish something called hunger hotspots. And what they're doing is they're predicting over the next 6 months what are going to be the areas that are seeing the highest levels of hunger. And so the darker the blue, the higher the area or higher the concern. And when you look at the dark blue areas, you see lots of different factors. So if we look at Mali and Burkina Faso, we see conflict, we see economic shocks, we see flooding, and we also see displacement. And the result of this is that we are seeing really high levels of hunger right now, higher than they have been in a decade. So in the early 2000s, the 2010s, we were seeing great progress. The world had set our Millennium Development Goals, our Sustainable Development Goals. We were on track to be reducing hunger. But then we see 2020, and suddenly hunger went up. And then in 2021, we had the conflict in Ukraine, which not only affected that region, but also many areas of the world that were relying on grain that was being produced. And now we're kind of stuck. We're stuck there. We keep having these crises that are keeping us at these high levels of hunger. And the thing is, this is where the tie comes really closely with food production, is that small-scale farmers are among the most vulnerable to hunger because they are subsistence farming. So here we have, we kind of think about small-scale farmers as those under 5 hectares. Obviously, there's a large range going all the way up to kind of about 50 hectares that are considered small-scale, and these produce more than half of the planet's food calories. But thinking just of the small-scale and very small-scale farmers, these farmers are highly impacted by the factors that we talked about. So if we look at those most at risk of being affected by climate change, and in particular droughts and floods are really the most common, and those have a significant effect on crops because we're talking about either too much or not enough water. So you see the darkest red areas are a lot of the same dark areas here where we have small-scale farms. Then we layer on this other map, those that are most affected by conflict. It's these same areas. And so these farmers, they're not able to produce food for themselves, but they're also not able to produce food for sale, which means that they can't earn other livelihoods, and they also can't sell food to those around them. Now, at the same time, right now, there is 3,000 calories being produced for every person. So what is happening to, if there are people who aren't having enough, what's happening to those extra calories? Well, either going on our wastes or being wasted. So if we look at obesity rates, at the same time that there are high levels of hunger, we are also expecting to see obesity rise in the coming years. So each year, the FAO publishes a report called The State of Food Insecurity in the World. And every region in the world was experiencing higher levels of food insecurity than the previous year, except for Latin America and the Caribbean. So they were the only ones that have been successful in reducing hunger, but they were also the area that was seeing the highest increase in levels of obesity. And why is this happening? How can we go from hunger to obesity? And this is called the nutrition transition. And this is because processed food is becoming available, much more available. It's becoming more affordable and more accessible. So traditional diets that are high in nutrients, that are high in fiber, things like, if we think of starchy vegetables like cassava or sweet potatoes and small fish and beans, are being replaced by these highly palatable, high sugar, high fat foods. And so we're seeing people actually make a very quick shift from traditional diets to processed diets. And that's where the increases in calories is coming from. And then, as was mentioned earlier, we're also seeing a lot of food being wasted. So actually, it's kind of hard to believe, but 1/3 of the food that is produced is wasted. And that's equivalent to $1 trillion US. And the areas where we're losing the most are in those really nutrient-dense foods. So in the fresh fruit and vegetables, fish and seafood are kind of the highest ones. And how does this happen? Well, we lose them in the field. So we lose them sometimes if there's an extreme weather event, like a flood or a drought, they don't actually finish growing, or they're destroyed and left on the field. At the processing level, we have certain ideas of what foods are supposed to look like, and so if a carrot is not perfect or an apple is not perfect, then it might not actually make it to the market. And then unfortunately, we actually have a lot of food that goes bad in our own homes. It might get lost in at the back of the fridge, or some people might not actually have the means to preserve food. So if we kind of quickly summarize, what are some of the things that are really impacting food security? Well, conflict, as we mentioned. So 1 in 4 people actually live in conflict-affected countries. We're seeing an increase in the number of conflicts around the world, and they're lasting longer. We're also seeing a lot more droughts, floods, wildfires. These are increasing both in frequency as well as in intensity. And these tend to hit small and medium-sized economies the most. So the agriculture sector in those small countries, they get hit with about 2/3 of what we consider natural disasters. And then of course we have cost of living. So this has a disproportionate effect on more vulnerable populations. So on women, on the poor, disabled, and religious minorities. And this is also where that nutrition transition comes in, is that people might not be able to access or afford fresh foods, but maybe they have processed foods that are readily available. So what are we to do? Are there any solutions as we look at the way forward?
Well, the way I say it, 1 carrot at a time. Bring up a carrot. You may not have noticed, but I love carrots. So we have to start small. And it's easy to get overwhelmed. It's really nice. So don't try to eat the elephant in one bite. We suggest that there are very different avenues for solution implementation. And it's easy for us to say, I can't do anything. I really can't do anything. It's just overwhelming. It's too complicated. But we're not going to let you off the hook, because every person in the room, in this town, in this community, in your home countries, has the ability to do something. And so the question then becomes, how do we break it down into the some things that we can do? And we've kind of, and this is not definitive, but we've kind of said there are 4 different areas that you can work on. One of them is individual action. One of them is sort of a scientific and tech action. And I'm not talking big tech. I'm not talking going out and buying a drone and applying fertilizer. I'm talking about maybe keyhole gardens, which was a big thing in some of the countries that I went to, just like growing a garden, that's techy. Or maybe there's some kind of social and economic action that you can do on a local and national level. And then finally, folks are from the diplomatic community. You have access to international social and action plans. So we're going to unpack those just a little bit. And if you are really super engaged, do them all. All right.
So starting at the individual level, I think sometimes when we think about solutions, we want to think big, but sometimes it's good to start small, and even before jumping into action, to get our heads and our hearts in the right place. So the first thing that you can do is simply think about where your food comes from. Every item that you have in your kitchen right now, how did it get there? And what was kind of the road on that, and how can you give thanks for how it got there? The next step you can take is to find out more about the people who produce your food. So if your food was produced locally, maybe you can learn more about that farm, or you can see, this product came from really far away. What was its journey here? And then you can think and reflect or pray, if that's something that you do, for a blessing and strengthening of all those who produce this food, as well as those who struggle to have enough to eat. So then when we think about taking action, the first thing is, how can you lean into a passion for food work? If this is something that's really of interest to you, how can you learn more about this? Are there local organizations that you can partner with? Is there volunteering that you can do? Is there some way that you can highlight this in the work that you do? Next, as you're making food, you can think about how you can make and eat food more responsibly. So one of the things that I think of is eating local seasonal produce. So oftentimes when we eat things that are in season where we are, they are cheaper and they are actually have a higher nutritional content because they're fresher. And so right now when we think about winter, it's hard to think about anything being produced right now, but there are some faithful farmers out there who are growing squash and kale, and some of those, and cabbage and root vegetables, while also recognizing that it's fun to indulge in some, a mango that's made its way here in January. And then thinking too about that waste. Most of our food waste happens at the consumer level. And so meal planning has been a lifesaver for me, mostly just because then I don't have to answer the question, what's for dinner tonight? And also not having to sadly throw away things that have gone bad in the fridge.
So the idea in the first one is that I think everybody is able to do that. Pick up one of those 6 being or doing, and do it. And for me, and for our Janet and Julie's mom, it was growing a garden, and you really get your fingers in the pulse of growing. Well, let me tell you, it's way more difficult than it looks. And if I had to live off my garden produce, I would make it for about 2 weeks. And so I'm humbled by taking that first step, but at least it's a first step. So this kind of leads into the whole idea of getting techy. And by getting techy, I mean, first of all, maybe you need to up your game. Maybe I need to up my game as to what technology is. So the first point I'm thinking about being is, what technology have you accepted now that you were once skeptical about? And how does that impact food? I'm old enough to remember when there was still a lot of information going around about how dangerous microwave ovens were. And you don't want to do that. There's going to be all kinds of bad things that happen to you. And now it's become part of our food technology, and people can warm things up, and there's a possibility of using that technology as a way forward to get meals on the table. If you're tight for time, if you have time to think. Now, there's a whole problem about processed foods, and I get that. But I want you to think more broadly about, is there an opportunity to think about some of the technologies which you now think are awful, terrible, and to destroy the world? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Second thing is, we want to look at solutions that are coming on stream to tackle food production and food insecurity. If we have made any impression on you today, solving this problem is complicated. So if there are some solutions out there, like being able to grow crops like rice or corn or wheat in areas that were unable to grow them before because of pests or because of salinity or because of drought, that's a pretty attractive option. And so before we throw it out and say, oh, that's genetic modification, or that's playing with all kinds of bad things, what we need is a good oversight as to whether it's dangerous, granted, but maybe that might be somewhat of a solution to some of the problems of food insecurity. And then finally, this whole idea of understanding that some ideas might be better than old ones. Let me give you an example. In 1973, I was driving a tractor. I did this every day, and I came in, and it was an open tractor, and I was doing something called summer follow, which is the way you can control weeds. You have a cultivator behind you, and if the wind was just right, all the dust went right into your face. And when you come in for the day, you looked like you had been walking through a dust storm. And that should be an indication that, oh my goodness, the dust that was on me is no longer in the field. And what you want to grow plants in is dirt. You don't want to grow that on you. So after your shower, you've found yourself again. But that practice of summer fallow in Western Canada led to soil erosion. And we lost crop yields. And so by 1980, summer fallow was never done anymore because we lost too much soil. So instead of doing summer fallow, we did something called zero till. And so we had the operation where we had the plants would grow, and then the next season we'd have a machine that would replant with the soil exactly where it was. And so we were able to come up with a new way of doing it, and it wasn't same old, same old. In fact, the new method was better. And now in Western Canada, there's about 1% summer fallow, and there used to be about 70% summer fallow in any particular year. So it's interesting how that's a possibility.
Now I am going to disagree with you.
I'm shocked.
And add that sometimes new can be old. And so this is what we see with conservation agriculture, particularly in developing contexts, where they are actually, I'm in the midst of overseeing the production of a short documentary about conservation agriculture in Uganda. And I just got the transcript back, and they were talking about modern farming methods. But what they were talking about was mulching. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a big, grand technology, but how mulching the soil can have water retention, and that allows the crops to grow. Or simply by planting something deeper in the ground and giving it more time to grow instead of trying to have 2 seasons in the year. If you let it grow for a longer time, you can have a much bigger cassava plant. And so new doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's technology, that it's an entirely new idea. In fact, going back to more traditional practices can be really effective, especially in areas where having a high degree of technology is not going to be possible.
And the other thing, I'm going to agree with my daughter, the other thing is that oftentimes new technology is very expensive. And so it's out of the reach of small landholders. Whereas old ideas that are reinvented and reapplied tend to be quite economical. And so small scale entrepreneurs have the ability to implement those and still increase their yields. And at the end of the day, that's what we're looking at, is we're looking at the possibility of increasing food security in some way or another. And sometimes it will be, there's potentially an expensive new idea, new technology. Drones are not cheap, and all of this data is going to be expensive. But a technology like Julia's mentioned is going to be more affordable, but yet still an innovation for those particular farmers. So if we move from the thinking to the doing, what does that mean? And in many respects, it sort of says to you and to your staff, what can I do on the tech side? Well, you may not be able to do anything. Tech might not be your thing. But on the other hand, maybe you are a bit of a gatekeeper for ideas about how new farming methods can happen. And the new farming methods can be the small scale methods of reinventing a traditional process or adopting a new technology that might be available. So if you're a gatekeeper, you can say, we should encourage this. We should encourage this. And that's possibly one of the things you can do. Is there any way to fund these new ideas? Is there any available international funding institutions that would make this a real possibility? Because you can't do anything to change people's minds except if you say, this is going to make your life better. And I have a sister who's a farmer, and she says to me, if you save me time, save me money, or make me money, I'm all yours. But if you just, tell me the moral position about what I'm doing is bad, I got stuff to do with the cows. So I think that's important. And then finally, joining a community. This is very important. My wife, Julia's mom, works in another area on the international human rights. I never cease to be amazed how important the networking is. And lots of people know lots of things, but we don't often talk to them. So if you get a chance to join a community or have a network, I think that will advance tech ideas.
So then we can zoom out to looking a bit more at the local or the national scale. And so the first step is to stop and think about what structural obstacles might limit solutions to food production and food insecurity problems. So this really looks different depending on where you are, because there might be different issues. But if you think about your particular context, what might be some structural issues that are really limiting solutions? And then to look into some of the policies that might be implemented to tackle these problems. So one of the ones that comes to mind that I deal with in my work is that we often think about when there is food insecurity. Perhaps if it's in a crisis context, we think about emergency humanitarian food assistance. So this is providing actual food in a food basket or a cash voucher. And then we also think about farmers who might be struggling and supporting them to increase their production, to become more self-sufficient. But we think about these separately. So we call it humanitarian work and we call it development work. And they're programmed separately, they're funded separately. But a lot of times those are actually the same people. So they might be farmers and then they're hit with a conflict or a drought and they need food assistance. But then after they receive that food assistance, they say, well, how can we prevent this situation in the future? We need to be able to grow our own food. And so those are actually the same people, but the way that international development work is funded by both the organizations themselves as well as the government funding, they're actually separate. And so what we're trying to do is looking at ways that we can actually make this part of a holistic program. So you might think about what that looks like in your country if that is a challenge. And then to act. So whether that's in your job or together with community organizations or your church, and you have the opportunity to be part of these conversations and be part of these solutions, that you're able to then participate.
And so if I take it up another level, internationally, you sort of say, oh, I'm just an individual, I can't really do anything internationally. We all can. And sometimes that's simply by finding the right organization that's doing the right work. And that's homework for you. It's not every organization that will fit your bill, but there's lots of organizations that I'm sure in this room we've all been a part of. We talked about World Vision. There's all kinds of organizations that are trying to move in this area. So generosity comes from our worldview and how important it is that you support organizations that are working to combat food insecurity. That's going to be different for different people. But the idea that our God says, I'm here and I'm here for abundance, you have to care for your neighbor. Who's my neighbor? My neighbor is the person next door, the person across the way, the person across the ocean, across many continents. So I think internationally we can all do something through generosity if we are privileged that we have the ability to give generously. Second thing is it's pretty hard to argue against working for peace because conflict is such a devastating cause of food insecurity. How does that translate? I don't know. I really don't. I wake up in the morning and I pray for peace, but I don't know how to pray for peace. So blessed are the peacemakers. And so I'm wondering if your work in somehow relates to engaging and supporting works for peace, you are tackling the problem of world food insecurity. And then finally, I'm going to go back to networking and serving. Where might you be able to roll up your sleeves and serve the vulnerable? Maybe that means that you're going to join one of these organizations. Maybe it means that you're going to serve the vulnerable in your own community. So you often hear of game changers. That was a real game changer. Well, we like to think of our God as a grace changer. And the grace changer so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would be saved. And what does that mean? It means that Jesus does not invite anyone to a private banquet. It is a community, and that community is our neighbor. And our neighbors are there feasting on this banquet. Looks a little chaotic. It looks like my house after a dinner party. But if Jesus was there serving up grace and reconciliation, there would be an abundance of food and fellowship. Thank you.
Let me start by thanking you. The breadth and the depth is almost overwhelming. It's just so complex and there's so many issues. But like much in life, there's always a start somewhere. So thank you very much for enlightening us the way you have. And I guess just a couple of very brief final thoughts. I was very moved, and I think it was the founder of World Vision who said this, who was a great speaker, and he would speak all over the place, but he would end with a challenge. And the challenge was, if not me, who? And if not now, when? And I think we're called to be intentional. Now, we know the tyranny of the urgent on a day-to-day basis makes often these challenges very difficult. But what we really need to consider is, how can I make a difference? And it's some people will do it in a small way, but small isn't necessarily insignificant. If you plant a mustard seed, it can be one of the tallest trees going, and that's one little seed, and we've got many examples of that. And of course, we're always encouraged by organizations that have a passion to make a difference in the lives of others. I would just say very quickly, in my significant travels in the developing world, I was never more impressed than with the farming community. I could not believe the hard work that these people do for not very much gain. And so if we can do anything, directly or indirectly, to encourage and to maybe share more of the wealth that goes on with that, we'll be making a difference in the life of others. Now, I'll end with this note before a spiritual reflection, and that is, having run a large C-suite coaching operation for North America, and at the same time I was traveling a lot with World Vision. Talk about a dichotomy of seeing rich and powerful and sometimes the poorest of the poor. And by the way, I always saw the greatest generosity and hospitality and character among the poorest of the poor. We sometimes are preoccupied with creating a legacy in life. I can assure you that there's a much better legacy that will live on for a long time if we make the difference in the lives of others. And I would like to end on that one spiritual note that I've always found very moving, which is from the book of James, and it's chapter 1 and verse 27. Religion our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. With that, on behalf of the Christian Embassy and its partners, we wish you peace. Thank you for being here today.